The great thing about recording is that you can take the time to get it perfect. The bad thing about recording is that you can take the time to get it perfect.
Welcome to another episode of Contrabass Conversations, your show covering life on the low end of the spectrum. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and I appreciate you tuning in to this show. And visit our site at contrabassconversations.com for all the details about what's going on here. And I would love it if you reached out and told me your story. And you can do that by emailing me at feedback@contrabassconversations.com. Please reach out, send me a message, let me know what's up in your life. And I know you're going to love today's story about Craig Butterfield. And Craig is the bass professor at the University of South Carolina and performs in a ton of different styles. We talk about his background and also his time studying with Jeff Bradetich and performing with Maynard Ferguson's big band. We also dig into what Craig's been up to recently, discovering the American roots music, whatever label you want to put on it. Craig's been a big Edgar Meyer fan his whole life and has really gotten into this idiom of music. And boy, you're just going to hear some rip-roaring tracks in this episode for sure. And I love to have you really focus in on Craig talking about how he shaped his focus, how his focus changed from undergrad to grad. He consciously shut out everything but the classical technique to elevate his playing, the classical playing, during his undergraduate degree at North Texas. And then in his graduate years, he totally expanded his horizons and branched out. And there's a lot to be learned in that conversation. It's very interesting. We dig into how can anyone ever make a living in this music world as a musician? And Craig's got some great advice. It's deep stuff, very useful content. And that's in the last 20 minutes or so of the interview. And like I said, you're going to hear some amazing music from Craig and mandolinist Jesse Jones, including a burning track called Pisces from their latest album, which is titled Pisces. We've also got Stickerfoot tracks, and links to both that album and Pisces are in the show notes. And we've got these tracks that Craig put together featuring multiple overdubs. And the videos of all these are on YouTube, so definitely check them out. And the overdubs you really want to check out just to see what's going on. The visuals are wild, and definitely give them a watch. And Craig and I talk about the whole process of putting those together. So I know you can enjoy this conversation with Craig Butterfield. Here we go. I'd like to welcome Craig Butterfield to the podcast. It's so great to chat with you, Craig. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on the podcast. I'm really excited about it. Looking forward to talking with you about bass and whatever we happen to talk about.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, nothing like geeking out for a while on the instrument we love. Tell us about your early musical experiences. Was it bass your first musical instrument?
Actually, I started on piano when I was 4 or 5, really very young. But the story is that I begged my mom for piano lessons, like just begged her incessantly, had to play piano. And I remember really loving it when I was a kid, and I started on Suzuki method is what I started, which I really very thankful for, because from very early on, I was learning music by rote, using my ear and trying to, figure out tunes by ear. So I didn't start playing bass until I got an electric bass when I was in about 7th grade, I think. The high school was really excited that I wanted to start playing bass, even though I was still in middle school or something, that I they're kind of grooming me to play in the jazz band. So they let me borrow an electric bass, and because of my Suzuki training, like, it was just very natural. I was, I think I was into Black Sabbath at that point or something in my life. And so I just took the bass, went home, and just figured out every note that, Geezer Butler ever played with Black Sabbath. And then it was like, every note that Steve Harris played with Iron Maiden. And then I got into like Rush and, more kind of like notey technical stuff, but all very much learned by ear. And then I got my first double bass when I was about 16, I think. I think I was really getting more into jazz at the time. And so I just sort of saw this progression as like, okay, if I'm going to play jazz, and I always kind of loved classical music from when I was a kid, I've got to get a double bass. I've got to get an acoustic bass. And so I remember getting my double bass, and I think the first thing I did was take it home and start figuring out some Stanley Clarke stuff by ear, which was like ridiculous because I couldn't play it, but I didn't know that. I didn't know that I couldn't play it. And so I'm sure it sounded terrible, but there wasn't a lot of barriers at that time. I didn't know that things were hard. I didn't know that you should read music. It was just, okay, I hear something and try to figure out how to play it on the bass.
Yeah, sometimes it's great. You don't know that that's supposed to be hard, and sometimes that can like open some doors.
Right, and I think that's actually a really important point. It's really my really philosophy about playing is I don't see things as difficult. I don't see things as hard. I'm realistic. I'm a realist now, but in my mind, it just means I need to spend more time on it. And that's all that it is to me. Like, it's not that something is hard. It just means, it's going to take more hours to get, but it's not that I can't get it or won't get it. And maybe that's, an ego or my ego coming in or something, but I really don't see things in terms of like easy or hard. It's just little time or a lot of time, but I'm going to try to do it. I'm going to do my best.
Yeah, that's such a great mentality for just making progress. I think my first rock band, I played in this Rush cover band when I was in high school, and the guitarist totally had that mindset. He was like, "There's nothing I can't do," and I never really thought that way, and I was like, "That's kind of true. That's very cool."
Yeah, it's funny. I had this conversation with a good friend of mine, Todd Markey, when I was a student, and I vividly remember this conversation. He asked me what piece I was working on, and I don't remember what it was. But I don't know, I said something like this Herodal Sonata or something. And he goes, "Oh, isn't that piece really hard?" And I just like was taken aback. I was like, "No, it's just going to take me a long time." And he looked at me and was like, "Isn't that what hard means?" It's like there's a disconnect in my head. And I was like, I guess it is. I just never thought that way before. I just thought that it would take me more hours. But yeah, it is a kind of a good mental state to come from, I think, that anything is doable given enough time. It might be years, it might be decades, but anything's sort of approachable.
Where'd you head after high school?
So back then, this is early 90s, the internet wasn't like a big thing, and it was very difficult. I grew up in North Carolina, and it was very difficult to really know what a good music school was, or to really know who a great bass teacher was at the time. So I was very kind of blind, and this is how I decided where to go to school. I looked at a couple different universities, and I remember looking at University of Miami. And the bio, I studied with Lucas Drew, who's a really wonderful guy and a great teacher. And his bio said, double bass virtuoso Lucas Drew. And I was like, that's what I want to do. That's what I want to be. I'm going to study with this guy because they chose that word in his bio. Like literally, that's where so I went to Miami, University of Miami in Florida. And I was there for a couple of years. And it was a very expensive school. It was a private school. And I loved working with Dr. Drew. He was great, but somehow I didn't really click with the university. So I transferred to North Texas to study with Jeff Bradetich. And again, even then, even after 2 years of college, I didn't really understand, how to pick the right teacher for me. And so my thought process was, I know North Texas has a great jazz program. They probably have a good classical bass teacher. So I'm going to go there. And it turned out, Jeff Bradetich is, one of the greatest teachers and players and pedagogues in the world. And I really ended up there quite by luck. And it happened to be the perfect place for me because I ended up studying with Mr. Bradetich for 10 years because I finished my undergrad and I did my master's and I did my doctorate with him. And it was such a perfect place for me because I could study with this really world-renowned, classical bass teacher and pedagogue. And at the same time, I could kind of go to the other side of the school and play in the jazz combos and play in lab bands and take jazz classes. So I was able to kind of keep my feet a little bit in both worlds. So I went to North Texas for most of my schooling.
And what a great place to go if you, obviously Bradetich is great. I had great experiences with him. And then what a jazz school. I mean, man, I know that you ended up playing with Maynard's band for a couple of years. How did that opportunity present itself?
Sure. Well, when I was a student, I ended up playing quite a bit with this really amazing drummer, Stockton Helbing, who's still kind of in the Dallas area. He played in the 1 O'Clock Lab Band and, just this monster drummer. And I would play some gigs with him. And I guess he got called to be on the band. I think at that time, and for a long time, actually, if there was a vacancy in the band, they would literally call up North Texas and say, hey, who's your top drummer? Who's your top lead trumpet player? Because that school has such a great reputation of turning out good players, but really importantly, players that could read also, because the lab band was such this like pressure cooker environment where you had to really be able to be a really solid reader to do well. And that's what they kind of needed in that band. So Stockton got that gig. And then I think a year or two into him playing, the bass player left. And so they asked his recommendation and he was nice enough to recommend me for that gig. And I think I submitted some recordings of myself playing or something, but it was mostly just sort of a recommendation kind of thing.
What was it like playing in that band?
Oh, it was great. I did that band for about 2 years with a little bit of a break in the middle, 2003, 2004. First of all, I hadn't had much experience on the road before, and suddenly I was in this situation where I was playing. We'll see, we flew to Thailand, I think my second week on the band, and we were in St. Lucia a couple weeks after that, and we went to Europe for a long time. And so I really got to travel a lot and see a lot of the world. And musically, it was a lot of fun. It's, that band is such a high energy. It's almost like a rock show, basically. I mean, we tended to play kind of the same tunes, but it was so high energy and exciting to play. And it was such a thrill backing up Maynard Ferguson. I mean, he literally stood about 3 feet in front of me. And even he was in his 70s at the time that I was playing with him and still just really playing his butt off. And it was really fun. I had a great time on that band.
Yeah. Well, it's cool. And checking out what you're doing right now, and you do all this playing that I would think of as like almost like in a bluegrass kind of vein, like what you do with Jesse. When did you get interested in that style of music?
Yeah, well, so kind of my main bass hero, and has been since I started playing double bass, has been Edgar Meyer. I just admire like everything about his playing. I love his versatility. I love his approach to the bass, and I transcribed tons of his music just to try to learn, how he would play. And so I think that I sort of had a lot of this vocabulary for a long time, but I never really played anything in like the American like folk, like roots music or folk music idiom. I never really played anything like that until very recently, until a few years ago. So Jesse Jones is a wonderful mandolinist and composer. He's actually composition faculty at Oberlin. But he's a great mandolin player and played on Prairie Home Companion and all these shows. And we hired him at USC as our composition guy a few years back. And we just kind of realized we had a really shared body of, we appreciated the same music. We were really into Bela Fleck and Chris Thile and Edgar Meyer. These are our musical heroes, right? People that could kind of do everything, that could fit into any musical style. And so we said, hey man, we gotta play together. And so we kind of got together and jammed a couple. I think he had a couple tunes he brought in. And I think we played a lot of Bach when we were getting together too, because we didn't have a lot of music. So we played all the 2-part inventions. And then we eventually started writing more and more. And we actually just released our second CD of all original music. So now we have this nice body of work to draw from. And it's music that's, we both kind of write together. Usually he'll have an idea of a song and I'll contribute a part, or I'll have an idea of a song and he'll contribute a part. And some of the music is improvised also. So we get to kind of use those skills that we have a little bit of. But yeah, it's been a real blast playing with Jesse and kind of playing in this American roots music / jazz / classical, whatever you want to call it, Americana style that I've listened to all my life, but never really played too much of.
It's such a tonally rich language. And then you is like this, the instrument with the sustain, you know, it's such a cool role. You get to play like these like fiddle-esque parts sort of, but you're also playing bass. And I mean, it's just got to be incredibly satisfying to play in that style.
Yeah, totally. I love that about it. And I love the exposed nature of the duo also, how I have to fill a lot of roles. Like, I mean, I have to play melody on a lot of tunes, and then I've got to really just lay down a nice groove sometimes. And so I get to kind of wear a lot of different hats, which is really great.
Well, I love that you transcribed Edgar's music. You went through and did that. And I'd be curious, because I think a lot about transcription, or, you know, when I teach jazz, I talk about transcribing. And what do you think you learned transcribing that you might not have gotten if someone had just like plopped down, if Edgar actually had those pieces published? What do you think you get out of the transcription process?
Well, I think one part of transcribing that's really important is internalizing, rather than just writing it down or buying a printed piece of music. When you transcribe and you play along with the artist, you really internalize time feel. You internalize, you know, little nuances of articulation. A friend of mine's a really great saxophone player, and he spent years playing along with Charlie Parker solos. Like, he'd get the omnibook and not just playing the solos out of the omnibook, but putting Charlie Parker on and playing along with it. And you get all these sort of nuanced things that you don't get when you just read off the page. And so I think transcribing, and obviously I did a lot of playing along with these transcriptions. That was really helpful for getting that, Edgar Meyer, for instance, has a really unique sense of inflection in the way he, slides into notes and the way that he uses the bow. And so I think that was incredibly helpful for me to not only transcribe, but to really get inside that style by playing along with those recordings. So I did quite a bit of that.
That's great. When in your whole educational journey, when did the idea of being a university professor become appealing to you? Do you remember when that was?
Yeah, really early. Gosh, I would say probably first year or two of my undergrad.
Really? Yeah.
Just decided that's what I wanted to do. I mean, I really love teaching. I guess I'm a bass nerd in the way that I really think and break down technique. And I mean, in my head, I'm almost always have this running dialogue going on. I'm thinking of a scale and, okay, is this the most efficient way my left hand could move from this note to the next? No, how can I do this? So I kind of wanted to share that, like be able to analyze and break down playing technique. And I also, honestly, when you teach at university, what they want you to do is perform and publish recordings. And those are things I wanted to do too. So in addition to teaching, I think teaching at a university allows you the freedom to go out and perform as well. So I really like both elements. I love performing. I love teaching. And so it's kind of the perfect world for me.
Well, something that I noticed, like that I admire about your playing, or that I also admire about people like Nicholas Walker or Hans Sturm, is like you're an incredibly well-rounded musician, and like legit in those. You don't just like play a little jazz. You played in Maynard's band, right? You don't just play a little bit of this or that. I wonder, people of all ages listen to that, but a lot of people that are thinking about like the next step in their journey.
Sure.
I don't know if you have any thoughts on just being well-rounded versus someone who just like is developing skills to play in an orchestra and then they want to teach at a university. I wonder what advantages just really developing yourself in other musical genres has.
Yeah, I think, this is a real personal thing, because I have friends that play in an orchestra, and that's what they wanted to do for a long time. And they've really dedicated and devoted themselves to that. And I completely admire that. And for me to do that, if I wanted to like land a top orchestra job, I'd have to completely retool, I'd have to kind of go back and really narrow in and focus on one thing. What I sort of did, and this was a conscious effort, when I was 18, 19, I was trying to do both jazz and classical. I thought, okay, I could do both of these at the same time equally well. And what I realized was when I was at that age, I couldn't play, for instance, a Charlie Parker solo. I didn't have the technical facility on the instrument to do it. And so I would think about that a lot and think about, well, why can't I do this? Who are the bass players out there that can really pull this off? And there were some amazing jazz players that could do that. Like, Niels Pedersen is another one of my big heroes, and he has this incredible, amazing facility on the bass. But I really looked at classical players as, okay, these guys really understand the instrument really well. And again, that's a generalization. Like, there's tons of great bluegrass players and jazz players that also really know the instrument. But for me, I just saw that, okay, if I study with a really great teacher, like Mr. Bradetich, and I just work really, really hard for a long period of time, I can maybe get some technique on the instrument that I can do the style of music that I want to do, whatever that is. And so I sort of used, classical pedagogy, classical technique, learning the canon of Bach cello suites and, Kusevitsky pieces and Bottesini concertos, and using that canon to be able to get around the instrument. And then, so that was when I was about 18, 19, I made that decision. So when I went to North Texas, the rest of my undergrad, I didn't play a note of jazz. I didn't play a gig or jam with anyone for about 4 years. And I just focused in on classical. And then when I did my graduate work, I started branching out and started playing more jazz. So for me, that was a route that I took. I sort of used the classical technique. And then once I I can sort of get around the instrument a little bit. I kind of understand how this bass thing works a little bit. Then it was just, okay, now what is me? What can I contribute musically that makes me unique and different? And it was this sort of, I always loved all this different style of music. I mean, I still listen to rock. I listen to pop music. I listen to jazz. I listen to classical. I want to be able to play it all. So that I guess in a nutshell, that's my answer to your question. And as a teaching standpoint, I a little bit use that same approach to my students. The last thing I want to do is try to tell my students, you have to sound like me. You have to play like me. I mean, I try to use a fairly regimented classical approach to the instrument when they're first starting. And then it's, okay, tell me what you want to work on. How can I help you do what you want to work on? For my jazz students, first couple of years, we go through Kusevitsky pieces, Bottesini pieces, because I think it's a great way to learn the instrument. And then it's, okay, let's work on jazz or whatever it is that you want to work on.
That's great to hear. What outside of like Kusevitsky and some of those standard pieces, do you have what are some things you like to work on with like your average freshman and sophomore coming in, just to hone their technique?
Sure. Well, there's a lot of great rep. I think a lot of the Baroque sonatas can be really useful. Marcello and Vivaldi sonatas are really wonderful. The problem with those is that they always have a great slow movement. The first movement's always great and perfect. Okay, this is great stuff. Let's dig into this. Then this fast movement comes up and it's just not idiomatic to the bass. So they're like shifting all over the place or playing 16th note with string crossings. And, that's very challenging stuff. So it's very hard to find the right rep, I think, for that level. Some transcriptions of some slow cello pieces or things like that can work really well also. So yeah, the Baroque sonatas can be great as long as you're a little bit careful with the fast movements.
That's something I've struggled with so much. I taught at DePaul for a bunch of years, and I taught the jazz majors. They had a classical lesson and a jazz lesson, and that was always like a tricky balance for me because I knew that they were doing transcriptions and they were working on bass lines and jazz concepts. So I was always torn about what to give them, and I had 2 years with them. So how did I approach? And I guess it depends on what level they come in, but sometimes I'll get someone that was real green, right? And I tried using the advanced books, but then I kind of felt like maybe that wasn't advanced enough. And then I would try something else and I felt like it was too advanced. It's just it's something I'm always thinking of. So it's interesting to hear.
Yeah, the advanced books, I use a lot of pieces out of the advanced books, the progressive repertoire books. And then Keith Hartley has a series that I've been using more recently. What I like about the Keith Hartley books, I can't remember the title offhand, but they're really good for the kind of the people that are, like you said, really green, because it's like, okay, here's half position, here's 8 pieces in half position. Here's first position. Here's 8 pieces in first position. Here's some pieces shifting back and forth, And I think that's a really logical way to learn the instrument. It's not how I learned,
Right.
I do kind of sit back. Okay, if I were to do it over again, how would I like to learn the instrument? And that's a valid approach, I think. But yeah, rep at that level is very challenging. And I think there's a huge opportunity out there for composers or people that want to arrange existing repertoire. Like, we need pieces at that sort of freshman, sophomore level. Honestly, we don't have a ton of great rep beyond that. So that's why we do a lot of transcriptions. But yeah, there's a big opportunity there for someone that wants to step in and publish some volumes of work like Vance did with his series.
Yeah. That's totally true. That's something that, just thinking about my own experiences, the other thing that I found really challenging, I don't know how it's set up for you at your university, because a lot of my jazz players didn't have a lot of experience and they would get thrown into orchestra then. And they'd be playing like, I don't know, Mahler 2 or something like that. And so you're trying to balance like Vance Book 1 and Mahler 2 and
yeah, for sure. Yeah. Exactly the same situation. And a lot of them are really new to the bow. A lot of them don't have a lot of they can get around the instrument okay, but don't have like really solid position, foundational kind of work. And so as a teacher, I'm always struggling with this, this sort of perfectionist attitude I have with myself, that I don't want to move on to step B until step A is completely perfect, and so I sometimes, find myself trying to be a little bit too pedantic. It's like, stop, do it again. I have to realize, okay, you've got to kind of go with the flow a little bit more. And because you have all these different needs, you can't just sit there and work with someone in a half position until it's great, because they're an orchestra and they're playing Brahms bass lines or something that they're shifting all over the place. So you have to kind of work with the reality of their situation as well.
On the jazz side of things, how do you approach teaching improvisation with your students? Let's say and everybody's at a different place, but let's say you get somebody in there with some ability, but they're just, that's just really new to them. Do you have, what are the first few steps for you?
Yeah. Well, so, when I was a student, I played in a lot of jazz groups and I played a lot of North Texas, but I never really took the time to sit down and figure out, okay, how do I really improvise? It kind of sounds funny, but as a bass player, you can kind of get by without really being a really solid improviser. If you can read and, have good time and all that stuff, you'll get hired. And like everyone is quick to say, no one hires a bass player because of their improvising skills. That's like pretty far down on the list. So it wasn't really until I had to teach improvisation, then I really said, okay, I've got to figure out, how to do this because I have to teach. They're paying me to teach this stuff. And I happened to work with one of my colleagues at University of South Carolina. The head of the jazz department is Bert Ligon, who's a really great piano player and great guitarist, also a North Texas grad, also played in Maynard's band. I started kind of observing how he would teach the improv classes. And he has this really amazing method of, basic counterpoint, like how do you resolve third to seventh? How do you resolve seventh to third? And he's got a couple books on the subject. And without going into too great detail, I sort of treat it as a series of counterpoint exercises done in real time. You've got to get facility resolving guide tones, essentially. And there's a couple of drills that we do again and again and again. So that's kind of on a basic level. And then it really gets into studying language and transcription. So transcribing a lot of bebop players, learning it on bass. I think that we live in such a great time on the bass now. I think even, I don't think that I'm that old, but, back when I started, there weren't like a ton. You couldn't like walk into a bar and see a bass player like soloing in thumb position. You didn't see people like, playing along with like whatever, Dexter Gordon, Charlie Parker things that much. It was kind of a novelty thing. And now I think we live in this time where there's no excuses, which I think is great. I think, we're being held and we should hold ourselves to a really high musical standard. So, just because, here we go with that concept of difficult or hard again, it just means that you need to spend more time working on it. So, with my students, transcribing Charlie Parker, playing it in bass, playing it in thumb position, I'm sorry, we've got to be able to play 3, 5, 7, 9 arpeggios in all keys in thumb position. That's just a skill that we need to have. So, my students go through, they do a lot of arpeggio work to kind of gain the basic facilities to kind of play bop lines that horn players, saxophone players would play.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned because I think we're about the same age, and I totally see that sea change too. Like at a certain point, it's like, wait, there are all these bass virtuosos running around, and I think a lot about that. Like how much of that is tied into just the rise of YouTube or like the bass players getting better over the last couple of decades. I totally see that as well. I mean, it's amazing times we live in.
Yeah, absolutely. There's something I think about a lot. There's a lot of different factors. YouTube is absolutely critical. For instance, before I really decided I was going to focus on double bass playing, I was playing a lot of electric bass and I was trying to learn I was slapping and tapping and do all this stuff, doing all these different things. And then I got the first Flecktones tape that came out. I think I was maybe 9th grade or 8th grade or something like that. And it just, Victor Wooten just blew me away. And the Sinister Minister, I remember sitting there for hours with the cassette trying to figure out, I didn't understand the double thumb thing. I didn't know that's what he was doing. And so I was trying to replicate these sounds, but I didn't understand the basic technique. And so I wonder now if you, because now you go on YouTube and there's 80,000 instructional videos on how to do the Victor Wooten stuff, not that he has one thing. Of course, he's an incredible musician, but, if you're talking about specifically the double thumb thing, there's lots of videos about how to do that. And if that was around when I was younger, maybe I would have stuck with electric or something. I don't know. And then there's this whole other thing with recording. I do a lot of recording, and the great thing about recording is that you can take the time to get it perfect. The bad thing about recording is that you can take the time to get it perfect. And so the more comfortable we are with recording techniques, the kind of more perfect playing has to be. And if you listen to old recordings, old LPs, maybe they had one take, or maybe they could splice together 2 takes, but doing a splice was so time intensive back then. And so their aesthetic, they were interested in a sort of different priority of things than we are as a modern listener. So I think some of this rise of the bass player is just an inevitable sort of rise in standards of intonation and tone quality, because the recordings that we're listening to are perfect. If you listen to an Edgar Meyer recording, it's pretty darn near perfect. And he plays that way live too, which kind of freaks me out. But, we're hearing this in our ear and thinking, there's no excuse. I can't play out of tune. I've got to play perfect. So yeah, there's a lot of things going on, but YouTube is great. And, I remember, my freshman year college audition, I was auditioning for orchestra freshman year. And I think the grad student was warming up in thumb position. I was like, oh, he's playing in thumb position. Wow, that's so cool. And now, of course, it's just everyone does it. So there's, even in the last 25 years, there's been a huge change in the level of bass playing.
Yeah, I mean, the accessibility thing. I remember my work study job in college was working at the listening center, and you people would come in and check out. You give a little slip of paper and check out the CD and go and listen to it, and just or going to the library to get my Mozart CDs so I can compare, and maybe I would check out 2 different versions of Mozart 40, and just it's astonishing. And like, just speaking of YouTube, and I'll make sure the link to these, but Craig's got some phenomenal videos of himself overdubbed video, like this Zappa, and you've got another one too. What's the other? I
did a Borelli Legrand tune called "Made in France." I did the Zappa one. I did one kind of a crazy thing. I just sort of did. I did a full big band chart of "Got a Match," the Chick Corea tune with the drummer. So yeah, there's a brief period of time about 5 or 6 years ago when I was really interested in exploring what I could do with multi-bass arranging and recording and videoing and it was very exciting. I was learning about recording techniques and learning how to use Final Cut Pro to do the video editing and started getting more and more creative with the video edits. But I really had a lot of fun doing those projects and I learned a lot for sure.
Well, how the heck did you even sync everything up? Did you have a metronome going or how?
I did them in different ways. Some of them are essentially lip synced the video, mostly because my video editing skills were not very good at the time. And so on some of them, I recorded the audio separately and I had headphones in and I was playing along with a click or with myself or something like that. And then I essentially set up my phone and recorded myself playing along with the recording. And then I used the audio. So I, use the audio from my audio only and sync that up to the video. And then some of them were done with a click, real time. Once I got more confident in my video editing skills, I was like, okay, I can do this. I can edit video and audio together at the same time. So yeah, a variety of different ways, really.
Yeah, but time consuming.
Time consuming. I mean, months of work of hours and hours a day went into those videos just again because I'm not really like a video editor, and that was the arrangements wouldn't take me that long, learning the parts wouldn't take me that long, but man, shooting and editing the video together would take me weeks and weeks.
Yeah. Oh man.
It's ultimately why I stopped doing those, and maybe I'll come back to it at some point, but it's all about how you spend your time, and I'm really happy I did that, and I learned a ton from that. And in a way, I got a lot more exposure from on the internet doing those videos than I did anything else that I've done. And I'm very thankful for that. But just, I also think like, I have other things I want to work on and other things I want to practice and I want to write music and perform live, and these things. And so I kind of gave up doing the multi-track videos, at least for now.
Yeah. As someone who sits here endlessly editing audio with a lot of my time, I hear you 100%.
Yeah. Well, the audio editing though, that is something I made a decision to do about 10 years ago when I first got hired at USC. One of my goals I knew that I wanted to record a lot. I knew I wanted to release recordings. And so I taught myself how to edit audio in ProTools. And it was not actually very difficult. It really took me just to, if you're just doing the same basic thing, you're editing like classical audio, you only really need to know about 10 commands, and the rest is just using your ears. And that was one of the best things I ever did, because I guess as a leader or co-leader or whatever, I've probably done 6 or 7 CDs now. And for all of them, I've edited all the audio, and it saves me so much time and money and enables me to record more because I don't have to spend money to pay an audio editor to do that. And I can also take the time to do it right. If I'm not happy with the way something sounds, I can tinker with it until it's perfect. So that's a skill that I'm really glad that I learned, that I think has had a really big impact on my career, I think. I mean, I honestly feel that my recordings are better for me learning that skill.
Well, it's a skill that ties in so well with just being a musician. Like it's a wonderful skill to learn. And mentioning you're talking about the video. My experience, I really shy away from video because it's like anything I can do in audio, it's like a factor of 10 in terms of video, in terms of the time involved.
Totally, yeah. And I was also operating like on old laptops, and like literally I'd make an edit and go make myself a sandwich and come back in 15 minutes and look at it and say, oh, that didn't look like, no, let me try it again. Let me go take a nap. So Yeah, exactly. It's video. I mean, there are people that do it amazingly well, but it's not my thing.
Yeah. I'd love to hear about your bass. I was reading you've got a Jim Ham bass right now. Yeah. When did you get that? And tell us a little bit about it.
Sure. So when I was a student in North Texas, Jim Ham would come down during the summers. We had this really giant summer bass camp there every year. And Jim would come the last few years I was a student there. So probably 2000, 2001, 2002, somewhere around there. He came down to just, I think he was just doing some repair work or something. He kind of set up residency at North Texas and, land of 10,000 bassists. So he had plenty of things to do there. And I kind of got to know him and he's an amazing, brilliant guy. And then, I think one of the years he brought down a bass that he had just built, and I had heard that he was building basses. And I think right around that time, he just, he started maybe a few years before that. And obviously, Gary Carr, he built his first bass for Gary. Gary commissioned him to build a bass. And so I was kind of intrigued. It's like, he's has so many great ideas about music and sound and everything. So we brought a bass down. And it was a funny thing. It was a brand new bass. I think he had finished it a few weeks before he came down. And I picked it up and played it. And I was like, oh, this is terrible. This bass is awful. And I was like, okay, how do I like say, cause I like the guy. Like, how do I tell him that? And then I think the next day I came back and played some more notes on it, and something about it kind of was speaking to me. And then by the end of the week, I did a 180. I was like, this is the most amazing instrument I've played. And what it is about his basses is they feel different in your hand than any other bass. Everything's in a different place. The shape of the body is a little bit unusual. The placement of the notes is a little bit different. It's just enough that if you've never played one of his basses and then picked it up, you couldn't really play repertoire. You almost have to kind of reset. And then the sound quality of his bass, to me, has a little bit of a different quality than other basses. It's a very, very clear tone that I love. It's just a little bit different. Every bass is a little bit odd and different from the other. But I just kind of fell in love with this bass. And so I by the end of that week, I was like, okay, this is the bass that I want to play. And so I commissioned him to build me a bass. And I can't remember, it's number 13 or 14. He built for me in 2003. And so I remember flew up to Vancouver, or to Victoria, the island off of Vancouver, and stayed with him for about a week while he was finishing it up, and kind of got to participate a little bit in the final setup of it and everything. And it's been my main bass, and completely honestly, I don't think I'll ever have another bass. I mean, I have another bass that's sort of my travel bass or second bass, but I don't think I'm interested in ever getting another bass. I like the idea of playing a modern instrument, and this bass just really suits me, and I sort of fit my technique around it, and I feel like it's my instrument.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I've heard such positive things. I've seen his basses. I don't know if I've ever actually played on one of them, but I've heard such positive things. That's great.
Yeah, they're amazing. They're great basses. There's so many different things he does with his instruments that just kind of make sense. And he's a mechanical engineer by trade. So I think that was his training, was in sort of, engineering and working with materials. And then he kind of came to like lutherie a little bit later. So he kind of approaches things a little bit differently. But, they're definitely not for everyone, but it's definitely the instrument for me.
I got one more question for you, and I love asking people this. You've done so many things through college and beyond at University of South Carolina. Looking back, do you have any advice that you would give your 20-year-old self, knowing what you know now?
Boy, that's a tough question. Yes, there is. And I think that this is a really good advice. I give this out all the time. I think music is a very challenging career. I think, you've written a lot about the challenges of making a living as a musician, as a bass player. And I think a lot of musicians are struggling with this idea of how are we going to make a living? How are we going to pay the bills playing bass or playing this style of music that I want to play? And as a university professor, the question I probably get asked most often by parents of prospective students is, how is my son or daughter or grandson, granddaughter going to make a living? Are there jobs out there? Are there opportunities out there? And I always think back to my colleagues when I was a student at North Texas. And there was a pretty, we were a very close-knit bass studio, and there was, 8 or 10 or 12 of us that were just really good friends, and we'd hang out, talk bass, talk rosin, talk strings, bass covers, bass wheels, whatever you want to talk about. We talk about it for hours and hours. And we were all different. We were all totally different in what we wanted to do. And I can't think of one of us that didn't kind of end up doing what we want to do. I think we obviously had a great teacher and we were at a good program, but I think if you have a clear vision of what you want to do and you work hard and you've got to have some foundation of early training is really helpful. I don't know if there's any such thing as sort of affinity to music or whatever, but if there is, of course, that would help too. But I think if you have a clear vision of what you want and you work really hard towards your goal, I think that you're going to be successful. And I think that if people kind of have that in mind, that's an extremely beneficial outlook to have. When I was younger, I knew that I mentioned earlier, I knew that I wanted to be a university professor from a really early age. And there are times like we all have these times in grad school when we're broke and, you can't pay the rent, or it's like, okay, do I pay the rent or do I eat this week or whatever? And my answer to that was always go practice. The poorer I felt, the more pressure I felt, like the more I practiced, because that was my way out. That was how I was going to get through this. And I think that's a really positive and healthy attitude to have that I'm a pretty big believer in.
Yeah. No, I love that. That's great. Yeah. It's amazing what opportunities present themselves when you're attuned to it like that. Yeah. Man, is there anything that we didn't dig into that you want to get out there?
I really like that we talked about sort of the classical technique is like a door to whatever it is you want to be, and that's a really important topic. I mean, Mr. Bradetich, my longtime teacher, is really big into this, is teach people how to play the bass, teach people how to get around. And then what they do with that is completely up to them, and it should be. I think that's a really important thing. And who knows what bass players 20 years from now are going to be doing, 25 years from now are going to be doing, or who knows what I'm going to be doing in 25 years. Maybe I'll be playing a totally different style of music. But I love that now we sort of have this flexibility to do that. That I was reading this article. I just mentioned that you write a lot about making a living as a musician, and I was reading this article. I'm not going to mention who wrote this, but there was a bass player, a prominent bass player, that was saying, I deal with bass players all the time that are lacking in excerpts. They don't know all their excerpts. And how are these people going to get a job? And my answer to that is, well, if they do know their excerpts, how are they going to get a job? I mean, there's no one way. I mean, I'm not disagreeing. I'm just saying there's more things out there than just orchestral jobs to make a living. There's more things out there than just being a university teacher. I mean, Edgar Meyer. I mean, of course, he's a genius and completely revolutionary on the instrument. But how is he? I mean, 20, 30, 40 years ago, would you say, there's a bass player that could write his own music and record it and play with Zakir Hussain and Bela Fleck and just the musicians he wants to play with and make a good living doing that? Like, that would have been unthinkable, 30 years ago. So there's a lot of good ways to make a living out there as a bass player, and we need to be flexible to explore all of them.
Yeah, that's a great point about Edgar. Like, that's not the path, Edgar. What are you doing? You're not supposed to train like that. And Yeah, but that's, I've been thinking a lot about like martial arts and just like training. There's just like a beauty in just training yourself how to execute these skills. And you can use these skills however you want, but the skills are valuable in and of themselves. So learning to play with the bow and learning to play excerpts and learning to play solos and learning choral concepts. And I mean, that's all part of being a musician. And then who knows how you'll apply it. That's a great point. Cool, man. I'm so glad that we get a chance to sit down. I love that we're hit on just was like making a living things. I decided for whatever reason, I interviewed a bunch of, I call them like young entrepreneur type people. And I put Lauren in that category. That's why I talked to Lauren, and so I decided I'm just going to like start off September and do like an entrepreneur week. All these people that are just like trained kind of traditionally, but have just gone like left or right a little bit. So
yeah, I think, I don't really consider myself an entrepreneur because I have a teaching job and so I don't have to be. I don't have to like go out there and struggle to do this. But it is, I want to perform and I want to share my music with people. And so I do book a lot of tours. So, I have two basic groups. I have a duo with a mandolin player that we play original music. And then I have a duo with a classical guitarist that we play more composed, quote unquote classical, but composed music. And, I book tours, we kind of trade duties on this, but booking a tour is a really interesting thing and takes a tremendous amount of time. You've got to sort of keep in touch with a lot of people, so that people that you were in touch with 20 years ago, you can stay in touch with them so that if you hit them up, say, hey man, I'm going to be in your area. Can I come play a concert or something? They'll want to bring you in, but it's something that I love doing. I love traveling. I love playing and my hat's off to people that can do that for a living, and put enough of those together that's how they're making their income. So that's a really, really tough thing to do, but really rewarding, I think.
Well, that booking thing, yeah, talking to Peter Seymour, Project Trio, he said that when they were starting out, they wanted their goal was just like do some kind of tour. So he put together a spreadsheet of 3,000 potential venues. And he called or emailed all 3,000 and he got 6 leads out of 3,000.
Right.
But then the next year it was like 12 and then it was 25 and then it was but talk about hustle.
I know some people that are really great at that and they are so disciplined about, they sit down every Monday afternoon, say, and they're going to email people and they're not going to hear back and they're going to email them again next week and they're not going to hear back. And then maybe the third time they email them, they'll get a response. So yeah, I'm unfortunately not that persistent. I should be, but yeah, the persistence is key for that kind of thing. Because we get these kind of things all the time. We get emails from people who do this, that. And, sometimes you intend to reply or that's a great thing. But then, you forget about it and it kind of slips down in your inbox and you don't respond. And then you need that third email before, okay, this is something I'm going to really work on. Yeah, I think there's, as a performer, I wish there were more managers out there. I wish there were people that were more willing to take on people that, no, I'm not going to make $50,000 playing concerts in a year, but if they could take on 10 or 15 clients that might each make, a fraction of that, they could piece together a decent living. It's very hard to kind of get management, to get representation. So that's why I kind of tend to book these things myself, because I wish there was more people out there that would be willing to do that kind of work.
Thanks again, Craig. So much fun to talk with you. And be sure to visit him online at butterfieldbass.com. And again, I'm so glad you're here with me, with Craig. Thank you so much for listening. It's such a thrill to spend this time with you. I get so much out of putting these episodes together, talking with these people. Every time I get off the phone with somebody or off Skype with somebody, I think that's really the best hour I could have spent in my life. That was a time so well spent. Now, I don't think that about everything I do in life, but I do think that about these interviews. I just so totally believe in them. And if you've made it to the end of this, I think you probably do too. And I'm honored and thrilled that you're on this journey with me. And if you're new to the show, or even if you're not, visit the website, contrabassconversations.com. I'm always working on the site and trying to make it easier to dive into this wealth of content, these 10 years of interviews that we've got online. So thanks again for tuning in. We'll see you again soon for more life at the low end of the spectrum.